Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I am author of over 30 published novels and a ninth grade English teacher. And on this episode, I have Christine Bailey, and she is going to be talking about her book, Burning Little Lies, which is out recently, I think in February, from New Mexico publisher Artemisia Press. And it is one that I have really enjoyed reading, so I am excited to talk about it. So Christine, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi there, DelSheree. Thanks again for having me on your podcast today. As you mentioned, my name is Christine Bailey, and I am the author of Burning Little Lies, a young adult mystery thriller. I'm also the author of 3 other YA novels and 1 middle grade adventure. And I've been teaching English at the college level for about 15 years now and live in West Tennessee.
Well, thank you for sharing that. We'll get into a lot more later, but this is a mystery, and it was an interesting structure that I want to dig into in a little bit. But tell us a little bit, what is the premise of the book, just to give people an idea of what we're going to be discussing.
Yeah, so the story is centered around the mysterious death of a 16-year-old Ellie Stone, who was found one morning after a high school party. And I did something a little different with this book. The book is told through 4 different perspectives, and the first perspective is told through Ellie's best friend, Tori. And then we move on to 3 other characters or classmates that knew Ellie. And what I wanted to do with the 4 different perspectives is the readers know from the very beginning that one of the characters knows the truth. And the story opens where you hear these stories or how it's told through these individual characters until we get to the very end, and then you know who was the one who was actually there that night and saw what happened to Ellie.
So what made you go with this structure, dividing it up between the different character perspectives? Because I wouldn't say necessarily like an unreliable narrator in some cases, but a narrator who's not revealing everything that they could be revealing. Right. So you're kind of in an in-between space there, and pairing that with the structure, I thought was really interesting and worked very well to keep the reader interested in guessing.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, I didn't actually intend. I didn't set out to use 4 different perspectives. I actually started writing this novel in a first-person point of view through the lens of the best friend, Tori. And I got really about 100 pages in, and I was stuck. I wasn't quite sure where to go. And then I switched perspectives to a different character, which was a male voice, and I hadn't written in a male voice before. And I had fun with it, but I thought, where does this story go then if he picks up the story and he tells his side of things? And once I started using that format, I realized that there were other perspectives that needed to be told too. So it was a little bit of an experimentation, something I hadn't done before, but it's something that I thought worked pretty well in what I was wanting to do. Because at first, like I said, I was just kind of stuck with the one perspective, and I said, okay, where do I go with Tori now? What happens now? So that's really how that came about. It wasn't intentional, but I just kind of fell into it.
I love when that happens. I think choosing perspective when you're writing is really tricky at times. I've had that experience as well, where I'm writing and plan it from either a scene or the whole book from one person, and then you're in there writing and you're just like, this is not feeling right. Like, this isn't, like, sometimes you can't get out the information you need to, or they're not seeing things in the way that they should see it. And it's something that I'll do when I'm teaching like creative writing, having students write the same scene from multiple perspectives to help them kind of visualize a more complete scene than what they started with, and kind of just an exercise to, push yourself and see who actually can tell the story best. Because I think that can be really hard to determine at times.
Absolutely. Yes, and I think that was something, too, as writing this story, I think I had in mind what was going to happen at the very end, who the person was who had seen everything. But what I liked about changing perspectives was the idea of going through these different viewpoints and then allowing those characters to actually surprise me. So I had a lot of fun being able to play with those different perspectives. So like you said, with that creative writing assignment, it allows you to kind of look through a different lens to see how there are different ways of, or different interpretations of, one night, what actually happened that night, how one person sees it and how another person sees it differently. So it was fun to do that. I hadn't thought about doing that creative writing experiment, but yeah, that works out very well, just looking at the different perspectives of a particular time and place and what that means then to the story and how it can change the story, really.
It does quite a bit. And something else that I think you touch on in this that I found intriguing was that idea of memory being subjective. One of the characters has had her memory complicated by the fact that she believes at the time she may have been drugged because she can't really remember things clearly. And then some dreams come into play where she's like, is this something I'm remembering or is this a dream brought on by trauma? And she's having a hard time putting together the bits and pieces that she does remember. And then we see that contrasted with the other characters of them feeling like they remember things clearly, but they don't know all of it. They didn't experience the full events of those nights. And so they're interpreting those memories in certain ways that is sometimes helpful, sometimes not. And I found those differences between the different perspectives really interesting because that's such an everyday problem in multiple situations of, whether it's an argument in a relationship or trying to think back and remember something that you need to take care of or whatever. We rely on our memories as humans, but they're actually very faulty in most cases.
Absolutely. I actually had a writing teacher one time when I was writing about a story that had happened to me when I was 15 or 16. And I had written this story just, in the voice of an angsty teen, and everything just seemed to be so troubling to, the character that I was developing. And my writing mentor had said, we sometimes remember things as different than they actually happened, and that in this particular scene, it seemed like the character was just really upset all the time. And she had said to me, we remember things sometimes clouded by, a dark time. And so we think about that time as being all dark all the time. But in reality, it's not really that way. Our memory takes us to that place. But there is good and there is bad. It's not all bad. It's not all good. And I thought about that too, that there are, those different perspectives and different ways of seeing and different ways of knowing. And so kind of bringing that exercise to characters, I've always kept that in mind.
I think that is a great thing for your instructor to have pointed out. I think especially writing YA, that gets really challenging. I started out writing YA. It's been a while since I've worked in that genre, but it's interesting now to think about how I was writing YA at the start of my career, and now I'm teaching young adults. And I've thought about how I would have to at times when I was writing teen characters, like getting caught up in the emotion and the angst and everything's the worst and all of that. And seeing that with my students where it really is their mindset on a day-to-day basis. So often where it's, one little thing happened and it's the end of the world, their whole day's ruined. And then you're, dealing with their emotional imbalances for the rest of the day. And it's one of those things where it's like, that can be very realistic to be in that teenage mindset of everything's so big because they're experiencing so many things for the first time. But to write that, it can be really exhausting for the reader if everything is always the end of the world and the biggest, worst, or best thing possible. So how do you work with that, writing YA and balancing out that very real teenage mindset of everything's drama all the time with keeping the reader engaged and sympathetic and not like, oh my God, like, why is she whining about this again type of thing?
Well, I think that's that challenge, it's a very real challenge. I think that's why, in part, I did want to do the different perspectives, because I didn't want to write, an entire novel through Tori's perspective, going through a really difficult time, not only losing her best friend, but also having parents who are going through a difficult time of their own. So a lot of different things going on with Tori, and I didn't want it to be like, oh, all of this is happening to me. And I didn't want it to be so heavy and only through her perspective, that I thought it might be interesting to bring in different perspectives and different voices, and also looking at, female voices versus male voices, and then making sure I was able to get the male voice right. I think that that's always a challenge too. So, I think that's partly why I wanted to do different perspectives, because I didn't want the reader to be bogged down in one story, one viewpoint of Tori and her grief. So, looking at maybe others who weren't as close to Ellie, and then looking at how they were dealing with that trauma. Because, even looking at a high school setting, when there is a trauma that's happened in the high school, we all feel and experience that trauma in different ways, whether it's a teacher or student or, a best friend. And so I wanted to really capture those different perspectives without lessening what was happening with Tori or with any of the characters, really, but just wanted a different outlook with those characters. And I also think another perspective in writing YA, the older I get and the further away I get from that age group, I rely on as I said, I teach as well. I teach in college age, but I'm, always, I have 18-year-olds, so I'm still listening to those voices. And I have a 15-year-old daughter, so she's kind of right in the middle of all this. And just, kind of keeping that in mind and keeping that voice fresh as well, making sure that I'm getting that teen voice correct in my novel. So that's always been a challenge too, to making sure that the voice is correct, that it's authentic. I think that's the challenge, always getting that voice where it sounds like a genuine teen voice.
That is really difficult. I think I've seen that especially with younger characters as well, finding that right vocabulary for the age group. That I think is really challenging, because unless you're around a 3-year-old a lot, it's hard to remember what exactly they sounded like back then. But I think a special challenge with teens too, and I've seen different authors handle this in different ways. There's a challenge in keeping it authentic without dating it, particularly with a lot of slang and references and all of that, which really pins it to a specific location and cultural group and all of that. It's kind of a weird balance writing teen characters where you're trying to get them to have that authentic voice and be speaking with that mindset of a teenager, but keeping it kind of universal, and I don't want to use the word generic, but not so specific to one time period or place. And I thought you did really well with that, because you do have a specific setting in the South, and there's bound to be a lot of, regionalisms or specific ways of speaking that I've seen with especially newer writers get really bogged down in that. And it complicates finding that voice and making the dialogue sound realistic. And with yours, I felt they felt very teenage without all of that kind of added layers of, trying to sound too teenagery. And just you were able to get into their mindset, I felt like, and have realistic teenage characters without it being overwhelmingly teenagery, like the stuff, I listened to all school year.
I appreciate that. Like I said, it takes work maintaining that voice, because, even in my day job, I'm writing academic articles, and that's an entirely different speech than writing, for or in the voice of a young adult. And again, just really listen and pay attention. I remember my first book, I'd written a character saying, oh, this boy was so, he was so dreamy, he looked like James Dean. And I had a beta reader go, who's James Dean? And I was like, I thought that was classic. Everybody would know who James Dean is. And, this 17-year-old at the time said, I have no idea, who that is. And so it made me realize, again, you don't want to date the novel, But I thought that was going back far enough where it wouldn't date the novel, but just give some kind of reference. But then I realized, that's a good writing exercise too. Rather than saying he looks like someone, describe what he looks like and bring your reader, right to that point. Describe the setting, describe the boy within the setting. What is the boy wearing? What does his hair look like? And just give those details. And, and part of that is just paying attention to what people are, or what teens are wearing and how they talk. But again, you're right, just kind of keeping it, universal, keeping it, I kind of like the idea too, in a generic in some way, but, making it more relatable, and always keeping in mind too with social media and how quickly social media changes. I'd picked up a book a while back and they were talking about checking MySpace, and my daughter doesn't even know what MySpace is, right? So we're constantly changing and evolving. And so like you said, you don't want to date the book, and you hope that it will be around for a while and that teens can come back to it, or, a new generation of teens can come to it and go, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Because when you think about the emotions, those emotions that teens go through, those emotions don't really change. Those are just human, that's human fragility, right? We're going through a feeling of being wanted, right? We want to feel wanted. We want to feel loved. We want to feel like we belong. And so when you look at those universal themes and drawing on the importance of those in the book, that's not going to change whether we're looking at the outsiders from, years ago to something we're writing or reading today. That theme is still relevant. We still want to belong. Teens still want to belong.
And I think that that's something that you focused well on, of making sure that it was the characters and their experience that were the focal point of the story, rather than the little details. And like you do, you describe, you mention at times, what they're wearing and the different things that they're doing. But it helped set the scene rather than controlled the story. And I thought that as well with your mystery, that need to have those answers to turn everything that you're feeling into something focused and productive, like you're doing something to deal with that grief or the unanswered questions. That is something I think everybody understands, whether, in this type of situation or just your day-to-day needing to work through and deal with your experiences, that was a great place to focus on for the mystery as well, that it really kept that interest level up. And I wanted to ask you how you planned your mystery, or how it developed as you wrote, because that's a tough thing, working through having your overall concept of what the mystery is, and then balancing it out and pacing it and planning those clues and all of that along the way. So what was your process for approaching that?
Well, I'm a planner, so, I had this idea at the very beginning of writing the novel that I wanted to tell Tori's story, but I wanted to bring back those memories of moments with Ellie and, and also with Piper. And I planned out what I wanted to do with the story and with the two brothers, with Nick and Hayes. And as I was plotting it out, like I said, I got to about 100 pages and it was just, a stop. And when I brought in Hayes' perspective, things started to change. And then I realized I wanted to go back. So the structure and the planning, I just threw it out the window, and I let the characters kind of tell me where they were going to go with the story. And I love that. I love when you have, the subconscious telling you, where your characters are going and where the story is leading. So I actually had an idea of what I wanted the plot to be and what I wanted the ending to be. And even when I got to the very end of it, that wasn't the actual ending that you see in the book now. So even with all the planning and with all the plotting and with all the ideas of, who actually was, the person who had seen everything that night, things even changed for me and surprised me because I wanted a little bit more complexity in the ending. And because like you said too, not everything is just so, obvious or cut and dry. I really wanted to look at the complexities there of dealing with this tragedy and looking at the different responses to that tragedy. But then I also wanted the ending to be not so expected. So I think that's where things change for me. So I always like hearing when somebody reads the book, like, well, I didn't quite expect it. I was thinking it was so-and-so, but I wasn't quite expecting. And so then I feel like, well, then my job is done because, I did leave the breadcrumbs and I did have a plan, but then I wanted it to be a little bit more complex of an ending, that it wasn't so obvious.
Yeah, I felt like as I was reading, I had those moments where it was like, okay, I think I know where this is going. I've got the clues in my mind. Then it was like, oh, wait, hold on. Nope, now we've got something else. Let's see where that's going now. I think you did a really nice job of that. It did keep me interested the whole way through and guessing. I found that a lot of the bits and pieces that you give the reader through the various characters, it was fun to see how that developed their personality as well as the mystery at the same time, because you're seeing which characters are thinking about what, how they are reacting to specific things, what choices they're making. And each of those little reactions and choices and thoughts give you the clues as the reader, but also give you a better sense of who that character is, which act as clues themselves. As you're piecing it all together, you're getting to know the characters, and then you're kind of going along through this process with them of thinking, okay, who's capable of what, who had the motivation to do, this or that. So it was a really nice blend of getting the literal clues to the mystery, but also getting a better understanding of the players involved to kind of lead you down that path as well and take you to the ultimate ending, which, we won't ruin for everybody. But I really liked that blend because I love mysteries. I write mysteries, love true crime. So this is one of those things that, like, when I'm reading or watching a show, and there are some that it's like, and some people really enjoy the more formulaic styles of mysteries, which is totally fine. But I've had experiences where it's like, you get 2 or 3 chapters in and then you're like, okay, yep, I've read this story before, just with different characters. Like, okay, I know where this is going. And, like I said, that's fine for the readers who want that pattern and that expected path to follow. But I had fun reading this one because it didn't have that expected nature to it. I liked the layers of the characters and everything going on in their personal lives that was leading up to the tragedy that you get those pieces and parts of throughout the book. Because none of your characters are simplistic. They've all got a lot going on. Young people struggling to deal with difficult, often adult situations that, they don't have the experience to fully process and understand, so they're doing their best with it. And some of them trust the adults in their life, some of them don't, which add other complications. So I really enjoyed those layers of complexity with the characters and their situations and their own personality and how their personality affected their choices and what they were doing throughout the story, and then how they moved through the events after Ellie's death. And was that something, like you said, you plan, but you did kind of let things follow how they were developing as you were writing? How much of the individual characters' stories and personalities did you plan in advance, and how much of that developed as you wrote?
Well, I think with Tori, I really did have her backstory planned from the beginning. I knew that there were going to be some complications between her parents, and that was going to impact her. And I also knew, of course, with the complicated relationship that she had with her best friend, as we see often, with teenagers who you have a very, very close friend, but then you look sometimes, years ahead, and they're no longer friends with a high school friend. And so I wanted to look at, the friends that we have in high school, and then sometimes why we no longer have those friends as adults. And then sometimes we have wonderful friendships that last for decades. But I wanted, again, to look at those complexities with the characters. And so I wanted to look at Tori, who really, this was her person. Ellie was her person, but there were complexity is there too. And Ellie wasn't always the perfect friend, and we're never the perfect friend to someone because we're going through our own personal struggles. And I think that's what I wanted to do with all of these characters, to look at, yes, you can have a classroom full of students, but each one of those students has a life and complications that sometimes we're not privy to. Sometimes they share with us, but looking at what's happening beneath the surface. We might have a smiling face in front of us, but when that student goes home, what's really going on? And so I wanted to take a look at that. I wanted to look at what happens behind the door of these teens and how they're grappling with their own situations and yet having to deal with something bigger on top of that, which is, the death of a classmate. So to answer your question, I had Tori planned out, and Nick was always a character in the story. I think he evolved a little bit more. He became one of my favorite characters, but I also liked his relationship with his brother, looking at these two brothers that were so very different, but were close in many ways. And so I wanted to take a look at that. And then I started thinking, well, what is their home life like? And so I think those two, Nick and Hayes, I think that storyline developed as I was writing. And then Piper as well. Piper was always there in the background, like she is in the book. And then her storyline came a little bit later. So she, I had to go back to the beginning of the book, to her chapters, and really develop her. And thinking about, I love what you said earlier about motivations. What is her motivation? What is pushing her forward? So, anytime you look at a short story, you always think about your character and the motivations they have. And so, in a way, this is a collection of 4 personal stories of these 4 characters and their motivations. And so as those characters are pushing the narrative forward, looking to the end, that's why it was a surprise to me, because I was still getting to know them as I was writing. Like I said, I knew Tori pretty well, but the others were, a surprise, especially Piper. Piper was the big surprise to me in, her home life. I hadn't mapped her out or planned her out. And so bringing in, this stepfather figure, Ray, that complication, and then, of course, her other complications, with the ex-boyfriend, Drew. So, bringing that in, that was fun, but that was more of an afterthought than something that I set out to do.
I love that balance of what you do plan, what you get surprised by, what develops as you go. I think that adds a lot of depth to characters when you let them kind of help you develop them as you're writing.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, and it looks like we are just about out of time, but I did want to ask before we start to wrap up, are you working on anything now that people can keep an eye out for in the future?
Well, actually, I am working on finishing the prequel to Burning Little Lies. So I actually started writing a novel first called Small Town Crown, and it actually happens before Burning Little Lies. So the two actually work together, and so I'm finalizing that book right now. I had written part of it and then put it on hold to finish up Burning Little Lies. So I'm putting on the final touches to that first novel in the series. And then I'm also working on a collection of short stories. So I enjoy working on short stories as well. And so those are the 2 projects that I have that I'm working on right now.
Wonderful. Well, I'd love to hear when they're ready, and it'd be great to have you back and talk some more.
Great. I would appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And Christine, where can people find you and the book online?
Yeah, so the book is available Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and then you can also find me on my author page on Facebook under Christine Bailey.
Well, just to remind our listeners that today's guest was Christine H. Bailey. There's a couple Christine Baileys out there, so make sure you throw in the H if you're looking for it. And we were talking about her novel, Burning Little Lies, which is available now. And I hope people take a minute to check it out. It was a really intriguing, interesting read. I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much, Christine, for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.